Thank you. And I'm not just going to talk about Google Maps. When I talked to Ashish suggested that I talk about, we have a conversation about what is required to build products for India, in India, and what are some of the lessons we learned along the way doing some of this. And also, what are the things that are changing in the ecosystem right now, which might help you. Can you lower those lights, please? Can't see the audience. And what is shifting in the ecosystem right now that will help you, and also things to be aware of. So I'll start with one of the things that is shifting in the ecosystem around the globe that we need to be aware of, and then hopefully, talk a little bit about Google Maps and also talk a little bit about India. So the key thing that is shifting dramatically and is going to completely dominate the landscape in the next 10 to 15 years is that silicon is starting to think, right? And many of you who are programmers and engineers know this. Some of you have heard of things like deep neural nets and things like that. And here's the how many of you are aware of the date at which the neural nets we are using today were invented? Can you just shout it out? Yeah, 1980s. So why is it that the today's deep neural nets are much better than they were in the 80s or early 90s? Huh? Data and hardware. That's the right answer. So I studied neural nets in my grad school, showing my age, in 1992. And there were several variations of these, multi-layer nets and perceptrons and cascade neural nets and so on. This was in one of the birthplaces of this in Carnegie Mellon. And most of what you actually see in deep neural nets today is not that different than what we used to have, except you have vast amounts of computing power being thrown at it. Data center size computing power being used to train these things and refine these things. So they're obviously getting better. And I'll show you a graphic which many of you might have seen, but it's very useful to ponder about it in the Indian context. How many of you seen this? Raise hands. Okay. If you're not, let me try to point out, see if we can. All right, I'll not bother. So if you look at that graphic and squint at it carefully, it will tell you that around last year or so, we got to the level of computing that a mouse or a rat has in the palm of our hands. Our smartphone has the kind of computing power that a mouse or a rat has. By the way, a mouse or a rat almost has all the cognitive functions that human beings have, except for the explicit cognitive functions. So it can actually do all the unconscious reasoning, vision, hearing, and so on, almost to the level of a human. The additional 2 or 3 layers which makes us conscious beings is what a mouse doesn't have. And most of the things we are trying to do when we solve AI problems are at the mouse level, which is why it's starting to work. And if you look at again that graphic closely, around 2026 is when we are supposed to hit a smartphone or a computer on your desktop with the computing power of the human brain. About 4 years ago when deep neural nets were refined, and I think about 5 years ago when the first version of deep neural net that I knew inside Google came to life, we were able to have a data center with about 2,000 or 3,000 machines with the computing power of a human brain, and it was no surprise that it started giving out results in machine vision which were very similar to that, and similar to what a person of average intelligence would be able to figure out. There is another interesting number there, which is around 2050 or 2060, with a lot of people around. Do you know what that date is supposed to be? I call it the inflection point. Many people think 2026 is interesting. I find the other date more interesting. So that's the 2060 date is the date when we will have a single chip or a computer on a desktop or on a phone with the entire computing power of all of humanity. Now this, I call it the inflection point because in this next 2 decades, almost everything we are doing as workers where we need to work will disappear. So let me repeat that again. Everything that we are doing, you are doing and I am doing, where we need to work to make our civilization or our economy run, will disappear. Nobody will need to work to make our economy run. People may choose to work to improve on what exists today, but nobody will need to work to make our economy run. And this is fundamentally galvanizing and also debilitating to a lot of existing paradigms and galvanizing to where we can be as humanity. So this is a picture of approximately from 1994 when Toyota was building, 1994, I'm not kidding you, when Toyota was building all of its cars in Japan, completely automated. They don't do this outside because of marketing and PR reasons, but in Japan when they build cars for the last 20 years, it's been completely automated. Now everybody does it, even for small devices and so on. Those of you who do not know, Foxconn, which builds iPhones and so on, has been on a tear, replacing its workers with robots for the last 2 years, and it expects to replace 60% of its workers with robots in the next 3 or 4 years. The reason why I mentioned that as an example is not because most of you have iPhones or not. The reason I mentioned that as an example is building a phone is a particularly difficult problem using robots. One is it's a very fine assembly process, lots of parts, lot of precision in hand assembling it and so on. And the other reason is the cost and the margins are wafer thin. When you build a car, the actual cost of the car which is being sold for $50,000 is actually $25,000 or $30,000, right? The total cost of an iPhone, they sell it for $800 or so, but the actual total cost of an iPhone is somewhere between $250 to $300. The manufacturer gets paid less than 10% of that, probably 4 or 5%. And with those margins, they are able to do it with robotics. And they are able to do this in China, and it is more cost effective for them compared to Chinese labor. And the same thing is happening in India. If you go and talk to yarn manufacturers in Delhi or auto part manufacturers in Chennai, they will tell you that the ones who are growing fast are growing with automation, and because of Indian labor laws, they are paying their labor, but the labor force is not growing. One friend of mine who runs a small shop in Chennai, he produces I think mufflers or something, he said that from 2004 to 2016, his business has grown tenfold. He has not added any labor. He has added 10 engineers, and he's told his labor supervisors that you're welcome to leave. I'll continue paying 60% of your salary for the rest of your life. If you stay, I'll continue paying you, but I have no work for you. And there are two forces driving that. One is the cost of automation is dropping. Some part of it is exponentially, some part of it is linearly. And the other thing that is happening is the cost of training labor is growing, and the precision and the quality required is also growing. So you have take these two forces, and automation is a necessity, not in the Western world, in India. So quickly going through, households are going to be automated. You have a household floor cleaning robot that is, not being widely used, mainly because it does not clean itself. The day it cleans itself, it will be widely used. Automated driving machines are starting to happen, probably 10 years away from reaching India, but most places in the US within 5 years, 95% of the driving will be automated. And my favorite is the Indian invention at the bottom right, is Rotimatic, designed and invented by an Indian mechanical engineer. She lives in Singapore, and this is unlike the other roti makers that exist today. You put flour, oil, and a few things in, and you time it, and it does the dough mixing, and rotis come out perfect. Service industry is being automated. If you see service robots in Japan, where cost of labor is much higher than in other places in the world, they can't afford to. In the low-end restaurants, in the high-end restaurants, people will serve. In the low-end restaurants, robots are starting to serve. Checkout counters are being automated in the low-end stores in the US. In the high-end stores, a person will help you. There's a pattern here. And so on, and the entire logistics industry. How many of you are here from any one of the e-commerce players like Snapdeal or Flipkart? That was yesterday, I guess. One. So you know this. Flipkart is doing this. Amazon is doing this. Amazon has 250,000 people in its employment. 50,000 people in its employment. and 250,000 robots, and they're starting to replace most of their warehouse operators, warehouse employees with robots at the rate of 30% per quarter, 30% per quarter, every quarter. And if you thought this was only for labor, manufacturing, services, and so on, think again. How many of you work in deep technology companies where there are only like 5 or 6 engineers? No one. Okay. So almost every technology that I have built in the last 10 years has required less than 5 engineers, including MapMaker. So all of the world's maps, all of the developing world's maps were built with a team of less than 5. We grew to 10 or 15, we got lazy, but the first version was done with 2 people, myself and Sanjay Jain. The next version was done with 6 engineers, and so on. It never exceeded 10 or 15 engineers. So a lot of what you consider as programming jobs are going to evaporate, and this is starting to show in the bottom lines of Infosys and TCS and so on. And this example in front of you are stories written by machines. Most sports updates and financial updates from Reuters and a couple of other companies are now automated. They are not written by humans. If you have a 10th grade education or above, you can spot errors, but the average reader cannot spot the errors, grammatic errors that the machine does. Art, most of the music you actually hear in elevators and most of house music is generated by machines. This is art generated by machines. And medicine. So I want to actually pause here and ask the question. I have been on the, my background has been in robotics from 1994, and I realized at some point, I went into it because I was fascinated by it, and then I realized that it is necessary for this part of the world. And the reason why is quite straightforward. We live in this pyramid of exploitation. All of us are beneficiaries of exploitation. And most of us, abhor it and will not allow it to happen around us. But our lifestyle would not be possible except for, large parts of the world being completely exploited to deliver the lifestyle we have, including the clothes you wear, the food you get, and so on and so forth. The only way to dismantle that exploitation or pyramid of exploitation while delivering a reasonable quality of life to everyone is through this automation era that is upon us. And I mean, as an engineer, I like to call it the era of infinite productivity, where productivity is infinite across all disciplines, and the only thing you do is you innovate and invent, and that is the only thing that needs to be done. Doesn't need to be done. That's the only thing that you can do that is of large benefit to society. So the reason why I paused here and made that comment is if you look at the medical industry, right, there are a lot of interesting startups in the medical space in India today. But the really interesting startups are not here yet. The really interesting startups would start healing people and finding ways to take care of people without doctors, right? And the reason why is we have on paper 2,000 patients for every, or 2,000 people for every one doctor. In reality, it's 20,000 people for every one good doctor, or a doctor that you would trust your life with, right? And with that kind of infrastructure, it is not possible to imagine how India will actually get, or countries like India will get to a reasonable level of medical care, where you have one doctor for every 100 and one good doctor for every 200 or 300 people in the West. That's the infrastructure they have, and this is the infrastructure we have. And if you want to do the math, the amount of money it will take, not using US salaries, but Canadian salaries, where doctors are not paid as much, the amount of money it will take to create a medical service experience for India, which is close enough to the Western experience, let's say even 30–40%, would exceed India's GDP today. And the same is true in medicine, the same is true in education, the same is true in social services, and so on and so forth, right? Each one of those exercises that we need to do would cause us to exceed India's GDP. So it is not possible in the current paradigm, no matter what kind of information systems you create, to connect patients to doctors and so on, to take care of them well. We have to invert the paradigm. We have to automate what doctors do and then create a CRM-like system. The answer is actually staring in the space, right? Large companies do CRMs this way, right? The first layer is automatic response. The second layer is semi-automated response. The third layer is when you actually talk to a person who actually assesses you. And we are at the cusp of that. In the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start seeing systems rolling out. There is a tricorder challenge happening in the US right now. It's an XPRIZE, where the challenge is a single device which does testing, analysis, diagnosis, and prognosis and prescription for the top 80 diseases that ail the world, which is 80% of most of your patients have those diseases. And I think the two runners-up in the picture here have already crossed 40. And we'll see what happens next year when the prize is announced. Here's a chip which does a blood assay and finds those stray tumor cells using acoustic, acoustic waveguides, and finds out the tumor cells which would normally take several $100 and 5 days to do. It does it in a few hours with a few cents. And an anesthesia machine. How many of you have doctors in the family? You should ask your family members how critical they think anesthesia is as a discipline. So anesthesiologists are typically, one of the highest paid in every surgical room, mainly because if you give too little, the patient cannot speak, but they are in excruciating pain. If you give too much, they die. Right? It's a very, very fine line band that which you need to administer anesthesia in. And here's a machine which has been FDA approved, invented at Johns Hopkins, which does anesthesia automatically without an anesthesiologist in the room, only a surgeon and an attending nurse for all but the most difficult of cases. So there are 4 grades, top 3 are handled by this. So that's the scenario, right? The Brookings Institute and the World Bank, is actually a colleague of mine who did this, declared a few weeks ago that 69% of India's jobs are going to disappear. So this is a country where only literally about 100 to 200 million people work. 69% of that is going to disappear, right? So I agree with Make in India, but for the wrong reasons. I think Make in India is being pushed for the wrong reasons. It should be Make in India and Invent in India. Make in India alone will actually not have any benefit to society. And by the way, this is mathematical. We don't have to have a debate about this. A simple example is a lot of things that are being pushed as Make in India are assembly lines moving to India, like Foxconn is setting up and so on. And Tim Cook is told, you move your manufacturing here. They will do it. I have no doubt they'll do it. The reason why is if you manufacture a cell phone, I use a sub 15,000 rupee cell phone because my users do. This cell phone, the cost of manufacturing was less than 100 rupees. So if you think about it as a GST, value chain, right, or a value-added chain, the value add for a cell phone being manufactured or any manufacturing happening in this country is less than 100 to 200 rupees. That's not going to add value to society. That's not going to bring us any economic growth. So we'll just become a dump yard of a whole bunch of assembly robots, right? That's not what we want. Across the world, McKinsey has a report, and I believe this is conservative, that 250 million IT jobs will disappear. And these are not the Infosys, TCS kind of IT jobs alone. These are also programming jobs. Because we are getting to the point where a lot of things that you would do. How many of you are programmers who love programming? Okay. Raise your hands if you think that more than 60% of the code that you write is just plumbing. Okay. About half of you agree, half of you disagree. I have written a lot of code. When I left Google, I was typically writing about 12,000 lines of production code every quarter. That was the average. And I've done this since the age of 16. And I started noticing, and so did my peers after a long time, that most of the code we write is plumbing. There's very little new algorithmic generation that happens. It's either you use existing libraries or you do a lot of plumbing, and how well you do the plumbing determines the quality of your code. The magic is, of course, the design, but the design doesn't take that long. If you know what you're doing, the design doesn't take that long, and more importantly, it doesn't take that many people. Even if you take 5 weeks or 6 weeks to do a design of a system that you're building, the actual building of it is mostly plumbing. And we are in the midst of a whole bunch of tools coming up which are going to automate most of the plumbing. And the economy is no longer going to be resources, capital, and labor. It's going to be resources, capital, and invention. And that's the reason I took this long. The reason I took this long to talk about it, I could have flashed through those slides within 2 or 3 minutes. I just wanted there to be no doubt that this is real, right? There is no part of human endeavor where, and this is, I mean, this is unlike any technology shifts that have happened before. No industry is going to disappear. I mean, there is no particular kind of job, like people who used to, light street lights with, matchsticks and so on. It's not like those jobs will disappear. There are no jobs that are disappearing. The jobs are getting compressed. From all the way, let's suppose there are 100 programmers today, we'll have 5 or 10 to 15 years from now. And the same is true for the medical industry, the same is true for all the high-tech industries. For manufacturing and so on, it will be a factor of 10 reduction. For the white-collar area, it will be 3 to 5%. And this is a talk I give to kids also, because kids have to decide what to do with your life. And if they're not driven by passion and not driven by excellence, then you're better off being an entrepreneur and not bothering with preparing for a job, because you won't have one. Right? If you're not at the top of the heap, you won't have a job. So I'm very happy to be talking to this audience, because all of you have made the shift, or most of you made the shift to be entrepreneurs. So I call it the infinity era, because it is the era of infinite productivity. It is infinity in 2 or 3 dimensions. It's infinity in the reach it will have. It's for the first time allows us to create an economic system where everybody is taken care of. But for everybody to be taken care of, the country needs to have taxes, right? For us to have those taxes, we need technology powerhouses or innovation powerhouses, right? We have very few. So the bad news is India has very few. The bad news is that India has very little capacity to build and grow these huge unicorns. I mean, I don't call a $1 billion company a unicorn. If it's not $10 billion, it's not going to survive in the coming age, because you will simply be overwhelmed by companies which have far superior technology infrastructure and far superior innovation ability. But what is critical is if you manage to create those economic powerhouses, all driven by technology in every field. I'm not just talking about computing. I mean, this will apply to the mechanical field, this will apply to the logistics field, it will apply to every field, right? If you do manage to create them, then the upside in those companies will then fuel the economy, right? If you take the top 10 innovative companies in the US across all disciplines, like in construction, I took Bechtel, and search, I took Google and Facebook and so on and so forth. Can you guess what not the market cap, can you guess what the total revenue of those companies is annually? Top 10. Total revenue, annual revenue. It's close. It's about 1.5 trillion, which is close to India's GDP. So you're starting to get a sense of what is possible. So it's not like I'm not predicting the future. I'm just extrapolating based on what's going on right now. What has happened with Google and Facebook, and more recently with WhatsApp and so on, like it sounds ridiculous, right? 20 people are able to create a app which is worth $19 billion. And they created, by the time I think they bought it, was 50 people or something. And the ecosystem that had to be in place for that, which is there today, was everybody needed to have a smartphone or access to a smartphone, and telecoms needed to be everywhere, and the app store needed to exist, right? So WhatsApp is a child of the app store. It's one of the first big children of the app store, right? And it's not the last one. So when I say that you have infinite productivity, you also have infinite reach. So if you create the right product, it'll just spread like wildfire. You don't need a marketing army, you don't need a sales army, you don't need an army of any kind. You don't need a manufacturing army, you don't need an operations team. You need an operations superstar, you need a manufacturing superstar, you need a marketing superstar, I need a business development superstar. In WhatsApp case, it was one of our own IIT Delhi graduates, Neeraj Arora, who was an ex-colleague of mine. And we used to argue about why not to buy an Indian company, because in those days, there were very few Indian companies worth buying for Google. But we have an opportunity, right? We have an opportunity to, now the reason why this is exciting to me is it's kind of tough to think about India as an ecosystem because we have a very poor ecosystem for innovation and invention. The market access is hard. If you do everything else right, your market access is hard. Many of you know this. But the exciting part is most innovations happening in the world of any worth have at least one Indian involved in it. Just look through, I mean, if you read Wired and if you read, Science Digest, Biotech Digest, I like to track, I mean, because I've been tracking this for the last 2 decades. I like to track space technology, biotech, and robotics and energy technology. There are very few innovations I see where there is one Indian not involved. And I don't mean an Indian born abroad, Indian born here. They happen to be abroad. That's a separate issue. So we have the human capacity to do it. We just don't have the ecosystem yet. And I'm hoping we'll get there. And the point that I was making before, which I cannot emphasize enough, is that there are a billion people waiting at the gate. And I say billion people out of a country of 1.3 billion or so is because approximately 300 million are in some way, some shape or form part of the ecosystem. These are the people you interact with, like the maids and drivers and so on. They are part of this 300 million people. There are a billion people who you have never met. You don't see them, they don't exist for anyone except for the government. They're not part of the economy and they never will be. Unless we do what we are supposed to do, which is to create information systems. I just met one of the, I think founders of Riviera. Sorry, I mispronounced your name. Who have been for the last decade or so working hard at Indianizing or localizing technology so it's available in local language context with local language, language issues and so on. That's one dimension of that, right? So we need to attack it from all dimensions possible and make information useful and powerful for the average person. It is not there today, right? And WhatsApp does not make information useful and powerful. It's a way to exchange pictures. Some of them of subjective motivation. Until and unless we do that, we are not going to be able to make a billion people productive. Now, I just finished waxing eloquent on how most of us will not have a job. So why should we bother? Why should we bother creating information systems that empower a billion people when most of us will not have a job? Why does it matter so much? Any thoughts? Not one? Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. So one of the key reasons, there are actually 3 reasons. So one of the key reasons is if you don't have this infrastructure to reach people and make them empowered with information, our inventions don't reach them. So you literally have to, look at this society as a society that will be left where all you do is feed them, right? They're no longer part of society. They have their own community, but they're not connected to the rest of the globe. Including having our innovations reach them. And our innovations are not innovations which are just going to be like Ola or WhatsApp and so on. What is going on in India is this whole concept of Digital India, right? And I'm involved in helping with design of some of the APIs for Digital India. The reason why I'm so focused on the APIs is the APIs will unleash a whole bunch of innovation. Now those are innovations that need to reach people, right? If you take the most recent governance shift, demonetization, they had to reissue 500 rupee and 2000 rupee notes because the average person cannot accept a digital transaction today. And it's going to happen. The capacity is coming. Within 5 years, everybody will be able to afford a smartphone and everybody will have a data connection enough to do commercial transactions, right? We are leaping from a data poor nation to a data rich nation, but one of the key things we need to do is to create the infrastructure, not just the, not just 4G and having internet and having smartphones in the hands of people. We will do that, and those are two preconditions. But assuming those two things happen, the application infrastructure, the technology infrastructure is not there, right? So that needs to be built. And when that is built, everybody can then consume services, and that dramatically shifts. That by itself will accelerate our economy by several percent. But beyond that, there are 2 or 3 interesting things. One is, if you take the top 2%, which are going to be the source of all our ideas and source of all our economic fuel, right? It's very unlikely it's going to be, the probability is low. I'm not saying it is 2%. Even if you are generous to the genetic theory of being smart people, creating smart people, it's going to be less than 10%. There's less than 10% probability that one of our children will be in those 2%. At a national scale, it is more empowering to find those 2% among those 1.3 billion people. That's going to be one of the keys to our success, right? It's not just education, also finding those innovators and finding those bright minds and deep hearts and people with fire in their belly, right? You can't make them, you have to find them, or you have to empower them so that they can find themselves and grow, right? So the top 2% who are going to be the innovators and going to be the economic engines of tomorrow, the only way you do this is you empower everyone. And the other one is a uniquely Indian and probably an American construct, which is small businesses, right? We look at small businesses as these limited entities, but there is an opportunity in this new world for small businesses to grow dramatically, to become almost global powerhouses overnight. And India is a country, when I look at India, I look at a country of 80 million small businesses, right? We are, if you look at on a per capita basis, we are more entrepreneurial than the US. Approximately 18 small businesses for every 1,000 people. And I think the US is around 11, which is higher than, again, every other developed country in the world. And the day we unleash these small businesses onto the internet, not just provide them internet, but make the internet useful for them, where they can interact with the right language technologies and so on. They can interact with the right application systems where what they are doing is visible and then can reach other customers and so on. Some of these small businesses will become global powerhouses. I'll give a very simple example of this. When I was in Google heading the product thing, one of the things I started doing is started spending time and having my team spend time in the remote areas. And one of the key things we found was that the internet was not making sense to a lot of small businesses. But there were some stories, people, in spite of all the difficulties, were starting to use the internet in a powerful way. And we found this Sunar in Calcutta, who 3 months ago had almost gone out of business. And then he had visited one of his brothers-in-law in Delhi, and he saw his brother-in-law using Google image search. And he said, "What is this?" And his brother-in-law taught him. And he went back and started using image search for coming up with seeing new designs and new contemporary patterns in jewelry, which he was not exposed to. And then he found a few ones. He found a few Western designs, and he was an excellent jeweler. So he started Indianizing those Western designs and started selling it. And before he knew it, 3 months later, he was getting orders from the US, from expats and so on, right? Imagine this happening at scale. Imagine him not only starting to sell to a few expats by word of mouth, but imagine the spread of his designs happening due to social systems, not just by people plusing it, but also using the trust infrastructure we don't have today, and so on, right? And the billion people outside the gate all of a sudden are inside the gate. So these startups we're thinking about are startups which are designed to empower people like this. And you have to be clever, right? Any go-to-market strategy or commercialization strategy has to involve the top 100 million people. Actually, the top 80 million people. Here's an interesting stat. By the way, here's the reason why most of India's startups are squarely geared to address people like us. I call us, people in this room, California Indians, because we live like as if we are in California even though living in India. There is a again, economic and mathematical reason why we do this. It's rational. It's not that people, like us don't want to build for the billion people. There is no reason why. There is no reason why a VC would ever fund you to do that. And here's the kicker. The top 80 million people in India constitute 90% of India's disposable income. That leaves about 1.2 billion people plus, and you smear the other 10% of disposable income. And disposable income drives the internet and drives modern technology sector, because disposable income drives both transactions and ads, and those two drive the internet and drive technology for us, right? So it's not a surprise that we are not actually building systems for the next billion, but we need to, because the ones who do are the ones who are going to sustain. So if you actually figure out how to address the top 80 million people efficiently or effectively, where they adopt your products, but you're also silently building for everybody else, right? You are building for the long term. Every other startup is building for the short term. So there is this, now to talk about, he wanted me to talk about the maps experience. Let me generalize that and say that we are surrounded by dark knowledge, knowledge that separates us and suppresses us and oppresses us. Now, people in this room don't feel oppressed because you have other structures around you and your education and brand and so on, which allows you to, rise above and then stay out of the oppression. But the average person on the planet is being suppressed and oppressed. And the only way to, empower them is to find ways to bring the information that is binding them and move it online, right? By the way, this problem exists in your life, except you don't notice it. But for the next 1.2 billion people we are talking about, this is debilitating. Let me give an example of this problem exists in your life, but you don't notice it. How many of you are aware of this construct called book clubs? Few of you. So book clubs are people getting together to read books and talk about books and so on. It's something that nerds and geeks like to do. Every community I have ever lived in for the last 20 years has had at least 2 or 3 book clubs. Parents organize, kids organize themselves, whatever, right? If you search for book clubs in Bangalore, you'll find less than 5. If you search for book clubs in the Bay Area, I did this 3-4 years ago, I don't know what the answer is now. I found 15, and most of them were essentially advertisements for a bookstore which was sponsoring book clubs. And the estimate of number of book clubs in the Bay Area when I did this analysis was about approximately 4,000. 4,000 book clubs, none of them are online, or less than 20 are online. Right? This is true for most of the information that matters to the next billion people. For us, because we are in the formal economy, we have figured out the HR system. You have degrees which are transportable across continents, not just across cities, right? And you have quote-unquote references from people who are working in credible branded companies, right, which support you. So you exist on the planet. You exist as an identity because you have the systems we are taking advantage of. By the way, those systems are extraordinarily hard to build. It takes billions and trillions of dollars to build those systems and sustain them. And we take advantage of the systems, but the average person does not have access to the system, will not. And guess what? The only way is to solve that problem is to build these systems digitally, where the cost of it is 100 to 1,000 of what it exists today. And I'll summarize it by saying by making a bold statement, and you can question me after the talk, that poverty is an information problem. Almost every source of poverty I have spent time analyzing is because of some information system missing, including construction workers who pay 30% of their monthly salary to the brokers, to children who can't get education, and so on and so forth, right? So the fusion of technology and the mind, which needs to happen, has to happen with people creating startups and ventures which bridge this top 1.5 billion people on the planet to the next 7 billion, and then empowering all of them. One of them that I was part of was something called MapMaker. This was the world's map, all the maps we had of the world in 2005. We started, the conceptualization of MapMaker happened in 2004. I started writing code in 2005. My partner Sanjay Jain started writing code in late 2005, early 2006. And we launched the first version internally late 2006 and then externally August 2008. Can you play the video, please? So I'll show you a time lapse of what happened when we launched in India and the small city of Madurai getting mapped. Just play it one more time because this goes fast. So we launched it, and the time lapse you saw in front of you took about 3 months. So there are 2 or 3 things to understand here, right? I actually walked you through the dates. I normally don't do this in a talk. I walked you through the dates for a reason. Most of the code that needed to be written for this to happen had been written by 2007, mid 2007. It took us until August 2008 to launch it in India. Actually, launch it in Pakistan. India came later. Pakistan and Vietnam and so on, according to Google, were low-risk countries where if we screwed up, it would be okay. And Philippines and so on. It's kind of demeaning, but it was partly data-driven. And then India was high risk, so India was the next batch we launched. And then we went to Eastern Europe and so on and so forth. If you look at the internal launch happening in 2006. In the internal launch happening in 2006, one of my friends in Hyderabad, Google Hyderabad, which was our operations center, hijacked 50 of his employees and silently had them work on MapMaker for a month, mapping the top 30 cities in India. And within about 40 days, we had mapped all the top 30 cities in India, Calcutta being the last one. And then we launched those maps to the world by December 26th, 2006. I think, yeah, 2006. So India Maps launch was using the maps from MapMaker done internally, and they stayed that way until we actually launched MapMaker publicly. So the key learnings are when you build for users, where this is a product which was built for users, but the actual product would come to life. Google Maps today would not exist in India had users not mapped India. Right. So why would people do things for altruistic reasons? There are 2 or 3 things. One is you have to make the results of their contributions visible to them instantly. Right. If you don't do it, people will not do it because nobody will do a whole bunch of work which goes into a black hole. They should be able to see the fruit of their labor coming to life instantly. And the other thing is you have to do it for the same reason that they are doing it. If you are making money on top of it and they are being used as free labor, users will smell that and stop doing it. They will not do it, right? So I was a big proponent of all the local businesses being mapped, where we actually pay people to map it because Google is going to make money when you map local businesses, and which is why the user base of MapMaker, the top users of MapMaker, never bothered to map a lot of businesses, because that was not pure altruism to them. And the other thing about user-generated content, by the way, do you know why I'm transitioning this talk to user-generated content when I just finished talking about the next billion people? There's a very strong connection. Can you say that more loudly? Yeah, they are that's the key point, right? They are the ones who have to give you the data. This data does not exist in anybody's databases. It does not exist, let alone online. This data does not exist even in written form. You cannot take a bunch of printed manuals and put it online, right? If you really want to create information systems for everyone, it has to be crowdsourced. And it cannot be driven by ads either. So you have to do it for those pure reasons, and you have to figure out how do you make money independent of that, and how do you then share it back with the ecosystem so everybody feels like it's fair. right? And you cannot find those users, the users have to find you. When we launched MapMaker, internally we found these power users inside the company. And externally, when we launched it, we found these power users outside. But we didn't find them, they found us. And then we had the logs and the systems and leaderboards and so on to tell us who they were, and then we empowered them algorithmically. There was no curation. There is no backend team going, who are the power users and who do we give badges? The badges would just go out, right? But we also had to build a trust system because, I mean, one of the key questions I was asked after MapMaker was live for a year and a half was somebody was looking at maps of Pakistan because that was the first country that came alive on MapMaker. Was looking at maps of Islamabad going, how come there is no spam? And they zoomed in, they said there is literally no spam, why? Because we had, in those days, machine learning was not very popular in those days. This was probably one of the first machine learning systems ever built to, solve crowdsourcing problems. We analyzed Wikipedia before we launched, and we found that Wikipedia had approximately 60% spam in the link graph. Because people were using Wikipedia to link to websites and bring their sites up, because Wikipedia was a very high-value website. So the link graph of Wikipedia had 60% spam. We could not afford that because if we have 60% spam on maps, people will stop using Google Maps because they'll simply drive off into the wrong place or they'll drive off a cliff and things like that. But this was a human machine interface in the true sense that the trust system worked because of seeding by people, but generated and automated. And what I mean by that is statistically, within a year of us launching any country, 80% of all the edits were auto-moderated. So all the edits coming from users were either automatically approved or denied with 97+% accuracy. That was our bar, automatically. And the other 20% was fueling this 80%, and over time that went to 90% and so on. It becomes hard after 90%. So this is the world after MapMaker. And by the way, I have explicitly excluded countries which had maps already, like the US and so on. So these are countries which had no maps before, about 180 of them. And lots of interesting things happened. When Pakistan got flooded, the UN sent us back a letter after they used MapMaker maps saying, of the 4.2 million people we rescued and helped, 800,000 people where aid was given to them, and 250,000 lives were saved because of the maps of MapMaker, right? And this was a success of not the product, but people doing it for each other. And this story repeated itself in 200 disasters which the UN did relief for, and so on and so forth. Here's a picture of a whole bunch of power users who found us. That lady with a scarf around her is from Iran, and she had spent a whole bunch of time mapping Iran, but hiding her identity because she was worried about persecution from the authorities. The liberal Iran that is there today was not that liberal in those days. And the gentleman who is highlighted there, Mr. Rao, CNR Rao, is no longer with us, but the last 4 years of his life, he spent mapping rural Kerala. And rural Kerala, and Kerala became the first state in the developing countries, of all the developing countries in the world, which was completely mapped because of his efforts. Not only did he map, he personally did 160,000 edits himself. And then his enthusiasm was so infectious that a whole bunch of young people joined him and did it with him, right? So when we say community, when we say crowdsourcing, you have to do it purely for pure intentions, and you have to, the only way you do it is you empower your community. There'll be a lot of resistance in your organization because you're giving control to the community, and that is not comfortable. And those of you who have worked in large companies know why it is not comfortable, because you don't know how you're going to meet your goals. You have to set annual goals, quarterly goals. How are you going to meet them? Because you're dependent on people you have no control over. You don't even know them, right? So, and India is in the middle of a revolution. I made a very, towards the end of my talk, but this is critical for all of you. Many of you are aware of it, but not aware of how big this ecosystem is going to be. India is in the middle of a revolution of its own, a digital revolution of its own. We call it the India Stack. It's been created by a whole bunch of volunteers, which many of are part of this organization called iSpirit, part of the old Aadhaar team and so on. And the India Stack is builds on what Aadhaar gave us, which is a unified Indian, globally, but globally in India, a unified, reliable authentication system, which is non-repudiatable for the most part, right? On top of that, a whole bunch of systems are being built. E-signature is live. E-transactions are happening. How many of you have heard or coded with UPI? Cool. All right. This is the only room, I guess, where I'll have the response. About 6 of you. UPI is the Universal Payments Interface. And those of you who don't know about it, it's a way for all banks to connect to a single exchange called NPCI, which is National Payment Corporation of India, where you don't even need to know that person's bank identity. Their Aadhaar number is enough for you to send money or receive money from them. Right? This is revolutionary. By the way, this has not happened anywhere in the world, where a bank independent ID exists for you to send and receive money. And not only do it in a bank independent way in real time with basically 0 transaction fees or close to 0 transaction fees. UPI 2.0 is being designed. It will be released soon. And it will have very interesting things like e-mandates and so on and so forth, which will bring the entire financial sector into the ambit of being peer-to-peer. So essentially, your phone becomes your payment gateway. Your phone becomes your ATM. Everybody is an ATM. You can transfer 10 rupees to me, and I can give you 10 rupees. Right? Everybody is an ATM. Everybody becomes a point of sale. The whole e-commerce ecosystem gets democratized, and you get to the micro e-commerce ecosystem, which is going to unleash a whole wave of startups. Right? That itself can be the genesis of a lot of ideas. But we're not going to end there. We have something called digital locker, which means any contract or any agreement or any certificate that is issued by anybody, not just the government, sits in a authenticated locker which cannot be tampered with. Which means if you have a bank statement and your bank statement is in the locker, or if you have a degree, your degree is in the locker, you don't need to do any verification about them. You just look up the locker, and the owner of the locker gives you access to that document, and you know it is real. Right? And I can wax eloquent about India Stack. You can read up about it. There is a website that's coming up which will have sandboxes and so on, so you can start playing with the code directly. But this India Stack is going to turn India from a data poor country to a data rich country. Literally gigabytes of data will be generated per person per year for 1.3 billion people. Right? And that will be the first wave of empowerment of these 1.3 billion people. Because all of a sudden you have a level playing field. Like if a driver comes to your door based on their payment history, you know that they have been employed for the last 10 years, and they can give you references, and all of a sudden you don't have the issue where if you take the average, if you do a survey of all the Bangalore drivers, right, the 3 sigma of their pay scale has a variance of about 40%. So in real numbers, that's somewhere between 10,000 to 15,000 rupees, right? Depending on, I think it's moved to 12,000 to 16,000 or something, whatever. The 3 sigma for engineers in Bangalore is a factor of 10, and I'm being conservative. So the entry-level engineer joining, one of the service companies gets paid about 2.5 lakhs or something, and the 90 percentile engineer gets paid 25 lakhs, and that is not, that's not the max engineers get paid. I'm just talking about 3 sigma. The 6 sigma is far wider. Now that differentiation that comes because of the skills you have, the abilities you have, does not exist for drivers, it does not exist for maids, it does not exist for construction workers, it does not exist for a lot of people. And it's not a surprise that nobody is upskilling themselves. When people talk about skill India, you don't need to skill India, you just need to empower India. If you just make sure differentiated income happens reliably, people will figure out how to learn, right? How many of you are older than 35, 40 years old? Okay. You will remember that in our younger days, when India went the outsourcing boom was happening, there was a small IT training center in every nook and corner, started popping up all over India. And you went to Jalandhar in Punjab and they had them. They would teach you English and then teach you IT, and then all of a sudden you had a resume and could get a job, right? So upskilling and a lot of these things we focus on, you don't need to focus on. The problem is somewhere else. The problem is the missing information system, right? Now we have that ability to build that missing information system. If you are thinking of yourself as a startup, think of this stack in existence and don't build for today, build for next 4 or 5 years, like Wayne Gretzky used to say, skate to where the puck is going to be, and the puck is not going to be where it is today. You're going to be in a very different world, and it becomes possible not for Google with deep pockets to build a map maker, but for each of you to build a map maker for whatever problem you're passionate about solving. It becomes possible for you to do that because in an information-rich environment like this, you will have the opportunity to get to hundreds of millions of users. A startup with 10 million users will no longer be an anomaly in India. It will be the norm. Right? And I think the final thing I want to say is that, the journey of, I was involved in 2 or 3 innovations which were all inspired by India. MapMaker was one of them, and before that was Google Transliteration, and so on and so forth. And I learned a few things about human factors, because if you're trying to do a paradigm shift, which is a technology shift which happens so fast, that happens in 5 years, and transforms how that particular problem is solved around the globe, and Maps was one of them, you face a lot of difficulty. Your own organization will fight you, and there will be a lot of doubt, self-doubt and doubt among your team and so on. And you have to get a little bit philosophical when that happens. In my own case, I got into a lot of trouble inside Google doing MapMaker. I think the project was cancelled about 6 times. And this was, by the way, this was in spite of Larry and Sergey being sponsors of this product, right? Because not everybody in the, and there was no evil person, not everybody in the chain understood what we are doing, and we could not explain, because you have this crazy vision in your mind, and no matter what you say, it doesn't make sense until you actually bring it to life. So for the 3 or 4 years while you bring it to life, it won't make sense to anybody other than you and probably 4 or 5 people who have joined you. So during that dark tunnel that happens when you build deep technology, you have to remember Martin Luther King's words that God does not give you a vision without giving you the strength to fulfill it. And also Gandhi's approach, where when other people are fighting you, you can ignore them, you can try to convince them, but don't hurt them back, because you need to win them over eventually, and you need to win them over to win the world. So with that, I'll